The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a free and open platform for theater makers worldwide. It's available on iTunes, Google Play, and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Legal. If you're like me, you probably don't know much about musical theater in Weimar, Germany, outside of the usual suspects like the Threepenny Opera. But there was a flourishing world of musical performance during this era, particularly in operetta, and it's a legacy that's been all but forgotten because of the intervening traumas of totalitarianism, persecution, and war. Luckily, the Operetta Research Centre in Berlin has been shining a light on the forgotten gems of the Weimar era, and, in the process, finding some unexpected resonances with our own time. Dr. Kevin Clarke is a musicologist and the center's founder. He's also been involved in efforts to revive works from the Weimar era and bring them to a 21st century audience. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Your work with the center focuses in particular on silver operetta. What does that term mean, and when were the works that it refers to performed?
The terminology of silver operetta as opposed to golden operetta is a comparatively new invention, new meaning it's from the 1930s and 40s. It generally refers to works of the time after The Merry Widow. So The Merry Widow premiered in 1905, and anything that comes after that would be today referred to as silver operetta, including the 1920s with all its syncopated jazz operettas, Charleston operettas. And what it means today is an opposition to the golden era of Vienna waltz operettas, so anything by Johann Strauss, Franz from Suppé, Mölleker, all these things that premiered in Vienna in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and before The Merry Widow, would be called golden operetta today. The term is deeply problematic because it sort of suggests that golden operetta is worth more than silver operetta, and if you continue this terminology, it'll then get to lesser metals describing the later stages of operetta. It was actually not used at the time of the creation of these operettas. So if you look at an operetta guide from 1931, this terminology doesn't appear. Instead, you have a description of Offenbach operettas from the 1850s as opera from the spirit of parody. Then you have the so-called Vienna waltz operetta as romantic Vienna waltz operettas. Then you have the syncopated modern operettas describing the 1920s. So this whole gold and silver is later, and I would say it's from the Nazi time, because the Nazis were pretty much in favor of labeling the Viennese operetta as the original operetta, blending out the Parisian Jewish operetta by Offenbach, and claiming that that golden operetta is like the highest level of operetta you can get to, and Johann Strauss being like the cherry on the cake. And they said that anything that comes after the silver operetta is a continuing degeneration leading to the Jewish Bolshevist and Artete Musik phenomena that you have from the 1920s.
That's interesting to hear how that term came about as a result of the rise of the Nazis, the political situation, because, as you mentioned, there's, all these new elements to the operettas from the time period that we're talking about. You mentioned, jazz, syncopation. I'm curious, what were the operettas from this time period like in terms of music, story, style?
One thing you should always keep in mind is that operetta was commercial theater from the very beginning, that it starts in the 1850s. So it starts in Paris and then spreads out very quickly via Vienna, Berlin, London, New York, Australia, New Zealand. It always used popular music of the time, and preferably scandalous music from the time. So when you get to Paris and Offenbach, it's the can-can as the latest dance invention, and when you come to Vienna a little later, it's the Vienna waltz, the polkas. When you then come to the 1900s, 1910s, it's the new things that come from America in this case, the cakewalk, early forms of syncopated rhythm. Once the First World War is over, of course, for the Europeans, that's a major break in its culture because the old system is collapsing or has collapsed, and people wanted to express how modern they were, how in tune they were with the modern times. So they embraced everything that comes from America, and that is syncopated music and what was then considered jazz. So it starts with shimmy music, with foxtrots. It goes on to charlestons later on and black walks. And operetta at the time, still being commercial theater, of course, used all of these dance forms. And if we're talking about Berlin and also Vienna style operetta, they mix this kind of modern American influenced music with the traditional European styles. This is what infuriated the Nazis so much. That's what the degeneration was, that you mix different racial elements. They wanted to keep it pure. And that's why they then went on a really big vendetta to clean up operetta history and bring it back to what they considered was the original goal. When you ask what the pieces performed were, it's a bit like going to the cinema today. I mean, you had a very rich scene of commercial theaters, and they played anything that audiences were willing to pay for. Today, you could go to a cinema and you could have a Hollywood blockbuster, you can have an art house film, you can have a queer cinema film, you can have a tiny low-budget film, you can have total nostalgia, you can have a romance movie. So basically, all of that translates directly to what you have in the 1920s. For example, in Berlin, as one of the major centers of operetta, you have totally old-fashioned pieces for those who didn't like the modern times and who were longing back to how it was before. You have the ultra-modern big pieces. You have the small-scale cabaret operettas, of which the Threepenny Opera was one. You have the film operettas made in Germany at the time that were very successful internationally, like the Congress Dances and the Die Drei von der Tankstelle. So it's a mix of all of these things. And interestingly enough, most of the successful composers and performers at the time really moved from one sort of area to another in this field. It's a bit like on Broadway, that people were in vaudeville and they were in operetta and they were in early musical comedies and they were in early sound movies because they were very versatile and they were doing anything that audiences would pay to see them for. And it's the same thing in Berlin or in Vienna or in London or in Paris.
A recent article in the Irish Times described some of these works as, quote, pansexual extravaganzas. And I think that description might be a little surprising for those of us who don't think of operetta as being especially risque. What was in these pieces and how did their content reflect the broader culture and the time period?
Okay, let me put this answer in two parts. Most Americans, when they think of operetta, will probably think of a book like Richard Traubner's Operetta, A Theatrical History. That paints a very nostalgic image of operetta as ball gowns, chandeliers, the men in uniforms, drinking champagne. That is the image that in America was attached to operetta from the 1930s, 40s, 50s onwards. It has absolutely nothing to do with what operetta originally was and why it was such a worldwide sensation. When operetta started in the 1850s in Paris with Offenbach, the main reason for its success was that it was considered totally immoral. It had nude women on the stage, and I mean literally nude. You can read about it in Émile Zola's novel Nana. It was basically theater as a form of brothel. You went there to pick up women. So it was a genre that allowed for great sexual liberty on stage and off stage, and that was why hordes of men ran to see the shows that were put on, and it's the reason why people, moral guardians, including in the United States, got very upset about it and tried to sort of get rid of operetta as quickly as possible, but they weren't successful. So that's how it started. Once the success of operetta broadened and the audience widened, you get more middle-class audiences coming to it who did not have such a liberal idea about what to do as the original high-class male audience in Paris. And so the sexual liberty is very much toned down. When you get to the time of after World War I and this total renewal of moral renewal also in Europe, namely in Vienna and in Berlin. This renewal goes parallel with the first sexual revolution. So it's a time of enormous sexual liberty, and that is reflected in nearly everything. And the song lyrics at the time for popular music, they are all highly risque, really way beyond of what Cole Porter did. And I mean, it seems tame by comparison. It's really very, very explicit. And of course, the people who wrote these popular songs are the same people very often who wrote operettas, or what you would probably call musical comedy. So many of these modern operettas at the time were about stories of young flappers not wanting to marry the man they're supposed to marry, and instead going on a world tour and having adventures and doing things that young modern girls were supposed to do. And they would use music that reflected that. So that's why you get all these Charleston operettas and syncopated Foxtrot operettas. And the pieces that were created in the Weimar Republic very much reflect that on some level or other. Sometimes it was really in your face, nudity, dancing girls, dancing boys also. That was very much something that Berlin had at the time. Homosexuality being presented under the disguise of something else. But also when you get to the more nostalgic pieces that also were very successful at the time, let's say like something like Blossom Time, there's always an element of the risque, of the sort of the kinky in there. It's never completely far away. It's never completely gone from these pieces. So if we're talking about these Weimar era things that are now being rediscovered, you are talking about a theater history or a theater scene that's very much like what you see in Cabaret, the movie. The Liza Minnelli, Joel Grey, all these little money scenes and two ladies and so forth. I mean, that's exactly what you would see in these cabaret venues in Berlin, where they would perform cabaret operettas. For example, like Misha Spoljansky's Alles Schwindel, Everything's a Swindle, which is what the reviewer in the Irish Times refers to when he wrote his article. These are very pansexual pieces because everybody is sort of potentially having sex with everyone. You should not forget that homosexuality at the time was still criminalized in Germany, so you couldn't actually bring homosexuality onto the stage by naming it as homosexuality and by sort of showing it as such. So it was always veiled in something else. It was either about the ancient Greek doing things, or it was about Nan's characters, or it was about good girlfriends. Marlene Dietrich sang a famous song, Wenn die beste Freundin mit der besten Freundin. She did that with her lesbian friend, Claire Waldorf, in a 1920s review in a big theater. Everybody could have sort of understand what it was about, but it wasn't actually said in words. So that's the pansexual thing. You play with all of these things. You use all these codes, certain kinds of nudity, certain kinds of Greek references or Parisian references, and people in the know knew what was meant, and people who didn't want to know could just pretend that they didn't hear it. And that's the pansexuality. And Berlin Operetta at the time was really very good at playing with all of these sexual levels in a very risque way. So there's always a punchline in all of these songs with a sexual joke or a political joke or both together. And that's what makes these songs from the time so really great. In a way that American songs, popular songs, Gershwin, Jerome Kern and so forth, do not have. By comparison, they're really, really like kindergarten tame.
Now, who were some of the major figures in operetta at this time? You've mentioned a few names, but I'm sort of curious, who are some of the big ones that people might want to look up?
If we're talking about the grand scale productions, probably one of the most famous ones is Erich Scharell. He was a gay Jewish theater producer, and he ran the Großes Schauspielhaus, which is was the biggest theater in Berlin with 6,000 seats that he had to fill every night. He started doing reviews, pure reviews. Then he got a bit bored with that after 3 years, and then he started updating classic operettas like the Mikado. So he made a jazz Mikado. He made a jazz Merry Widow right after Erich von Stroheim did the Hollywood jazz version of the Merry Widow in 1925. So 1926 you have Erich Scharell's version. And then in 1927 he turns to creating new works, and they are historic settings, so like the Three Musketeers, Casanova, and then the White Horse Inn. But he tells these historic stories by mixing classic music from opera, from symphonies, and so forth, with brand new syncopated songs. So in the White Horse Inn, which is the most famous of this group, he has the Tyrolean dancers doing their slap dancing number, and the next minute you have someone coming on doing a foxtrot on stage in the Alps. So that's how he used modernity. It's a bit like a Baz Luhrmann movie, so that everything's jammed into there and then mixed up and then spit out in a recycled way. That was the most successful single theater producer at the time, and the White Horse Inn is the most famous single show that came out of this particular tradition. At the same time, you have Franz Lehar, the composer of The Merry Widow, writing his tragic operettas for Richard Tauber in Berlin. So it's a bit like Lloyd Webber's Phantom of the Opera, but 80 years earlier. Richard Tauber starred in The Land of Smiles, in Friederike, in Paganini. These were big opera pieces where Richard Tauber was the star, and everything was sort of totally tailor-made for him. So that's the other big one. Then you have these smaller scale cabaret operettas. The Threepenny Opera is the most famous one of those, but it was just one of very many. Misha Spoliansky wrote a lot of those as well. Friedrich Holländer, who later became very famous as a Hollywood composer, writing for Marlene Dietrich among others, was one of them. Then you have the film operettas, the early ones, mostly composed by Werner Richard Heimann. He became very famous later in Hollywood too. He had many Oscar nominations, for example, for Ninotchka, the great Greta Garbo movie. He started out as the music director for the UFA, which was the big production company in Berlin, and they made one big movie after the other. So you have, those are sort of the big ones, and all the stars, all the composers, and all the producers, basically, they circle from one of these genres to the other and basically dip their toe into all of them.
Now, what happens to operetta in the 1930s as the Nazis gain power, and then later in the aftermath of World War II?
In late 1932, you reach the absolute height of jazz operetta with pieces by Paul Abraham, who is like I would say, the greatest of all German language jazz composers, even though he's Hungarian by origin. His last show in Berlin is the Bal im Savoy, which premieres in December 1932. And then in January 1933, the Nazis come to power, as you probably know, and they immediately set out to change that whole system. The change means that they labeled this mixing of jazz and German national music, or what they considered German, like Vienna Waltz also. This mixing was what they wanted to get rid of, and they wanted to get rid of all of these popular 1920s shows, which were written nearly exclusively by Jewish composers, Jewish lyricists, produced by Jewish producers, with a big Jewish audience. So that all had to go. And their ideal was to go back to the Vienna waltz operettas from the 1880s, but because at least the composers in that case were Christian. Never mind that the lyricists were all Jewish too. So they started a campaign that basically eliminated these newer works from the 1920s and got rid of them. The way they got rid of them was a very simple trick, really, because they changed the theater system in Germany. As I said, before that, you have a commercial theater system where anything that sells a ticket would be put on. After 1933, you have a subsidized theater system, and the subsidy, of course, means you only get the money if the politicians give you the money. So suddenly, the theater directors are not playing shows because they attract an audience with it, but because Joseph Goebbels, in this case, as the propaganda minister, approves of their choice of pieces and gives them money. So suddenly everything becomes political and the whole system changes. Very sadly, after 1945, German theater did not go back to the commercial system, but it stayed a subsidized system to this very day. The subsidy system meant that suddenly all these old and nearly forgotten pieces by Johann Strauss, by Mülleker, by Suppé were suddenly brought back, and they were brought back with opera singers because the Nazis claimed that would ennoble them them somehow. And that's what you get to hear on all of those old radio broadcasts and many of these old recordings. At the same time, the audience, of course, didn't want to just hear old, I'm not saying old fart pieces, but let's say old-fashioned pieces from the 1880s. They were used to modern shows. And so the Nazis brought in a whole new generation of composers, basically second-rate composers, to write things in the style of the 1920s. But these composers were not Jewish, and they weren't as radical in their use of jazz elements and syncopated elements. So suddenly, instead of, let's say, Michel Spoljansky, Kurt Weill, Paul Abraham, you get composers like Peter Kreuder, Fred Raimond, and so forth. And it sort of all sounds swingy and nice. And from an American perspective, you probably think you're in a 1930s, 1940s Hollywood movie, but it's never as good and it's never as original as the older composer generation was. So in the 1930s, 40s, you get a whole series of film operettas and also stage review operettas that continue that Weimar tradition without being as sexually explicit, but without being completely tame either. And what happens then is that after World War II, the big change happens. There is a famous historian, she's called Dagmar Herzog. She teaches at New York University. She wrote a book about the sexual politics of the 20th century in Germany, and she claims that the sexual revolution, the first sexual revolution of the 20s, basically continues in Nazi times, because the Nazis were really propagating a very liberal attitude towards sexuality. If you were one of the right Aryans, so if you weren't one of the persecuted groups, and if you were one of the people that they considered worthy of staying in Germany, you could have as much sex with whoever you wanted and enjoy it. And a lot of people did. Obviously, after 1945, when the guilt question arose and people said, what did you do when all of these Jewish people and all of the other people were taken to concentration camps? Germans didn't want to say, we're having a fabulous time fucking around. Instead, they said, oh God, we were completely in repression, and so this whole sexual side was blended out. And when the new German states were founded in 1946, the Christian churches, the Catholic and the Protestant churches, said, listen, after this moral disaster of the Nazis, you need a guiding light. We are going to be that guiding light, and you should live according to our Christian ideals. So exactly what the Nazis didn't do happens after 1949, which is why in the 1950s and 60s in Germany, you live in a very sexually repressed era. And the operettas that were put on really reflect that. They take the sex that was already taken out a bit by the Nazis to the extreme and completely desexualize operetta. And of course, audiences in the 50s and 60s in that climate did not want to hear syncopated jazz operettas from the 1920s with pansexual things happening on stage. So that's basically why these shows were really forgotten for a very, very long time. And it's only in the last, I would say, 10 years, for the first time ever, that this restricted sexual political climate is overcome finally, and we're going back, we're trying to reconnect, or younger audiences in Germany are trying to reconnect with that Weimar era buzz and suddenly discover how much fun Germans were able to have on stage back then. And you sort of wonder why it took so long to get back there.
As you just mentioned there are these efforts now to revive these works, and I'm wondering, what can you tell us about the recent revivals and how they've been received?
I think there's a new audience, that's for sure. And the new audience that didn't grow up in the 50s and 60s in that climate of sexual repression, they really want their lifestyle reflected when they go to the theater, when they go to the movies, when they watch TV shows. So they want sex, they want fun, they want something that arouses their interest in some way. When I grew up, I was born in 1967 in Berlin. In the 70s and 80s, it was definitely not cool to be proud of being German. You wouldn't run around waving a flag because it always meant you were some kind of neo-Nazi and sort of reviving the worst parts of German history. Then in 2006, we had the football World Championship in Germany, and a lot of people suddenly discovered that Germany is actually quite a cool place. Germans have a sense of humor. They can be attractive. They know how to party. Berlin is a super cool city. And suddenly the Germans themselves thought, oh yeah, if the whole world sees us like that, maybe it's true. Maybe we are cool. And maybe it's not all gray and dark and guilt-ridden as we were always told. Maybe there is something other than the classics, other than Goethe, Beethoven, and Wagner out there. And suddenly they see that in the Weimar era, there was this buzzing entertainment industry right here under our noses. And they produced all of these fabulous shows apart from the Three-Penny Opera. And these pansexual, syncopated shows from the 20s are really quite close to what the new Berlin feeling is all about. And it's certainly no coincidence that you have a TV series like Berlin Babylon now, exactly trying to revive that Berlin feeling from the 1920s, and that films like Cabaret are so popular again, and that people sort of think, wow, we want to get back to that sexual liberty that was there, to this musical liberty, to the originality of what was being created, how these international influences that came from the US were mixed with the German culture and then sort of come out again as something uniquely unique in a way, something that only the Germans produced at the time. And I think that's why this new audience says we don't want to hear the Merry Widow for the 10,000th time, and we don't want to hear the Fledermaus, the Bat by Johann Strauss again and again and again. We want to discover something new, something that we can relate to. And Barry Kosky, the Australian director who works at the Komische Oper, was the first one to really to do that. He brought back Paul Abraham's Bal im Savoy. That's the piece from December 1932, sort of the pinnacle of the jazz operettas from Berlin. And he landed a major smash hit with that. You can see the trailer on YouTube, and it gives you a pretty good idea of what it's all about. And he didn't just revive that jazz sound, he used a different kind of cast. So instead of you having your traditional opera singers standing there with a champagne glass in their hands and sort of waltzing around with a ball gown, he put big film stars and musical comedy stars onto that stage. And they don't sing with opera voices. They sing with their what you would call musical comedy voices. I mean, for Americans, that's probably the most common thing in the world. Glenn Close stars in Sunset Boulevard or other people like that. That's no big deal. In Germany, it was not done because the critics always said, yeah, but this music needs to be sung properly. Otherwise, you're not doing it justice. So Barry Kosky said, fuck all of that. Pardon my language. I'm just going to put a big actress like Dagmar Mansell on there, and she really rocks the stage. And he has Katharine Mehrling there and some other people as well. And he put a half-nude boy dance group on there, also half-nude girls, so it's equally distributed. But it's very gay. And he really emphasizes that sort of kinky pansexual 1920s aesthetic. And it was a major success. And he repeated it after that with two Oscar Strauss operettas. The one was Eine Frau, die weiß, was sie will, which he staged with two people, very minimalistic, very cabaret style. The two people, a man and a woman, they play 33 roles, sometimes at the same time. It's really hilarious, and it's always sold out. And then he brought back Die Perlen der Cleopatra, which is the Pearls of Cleopatra, an early 1920s jazz show that's, again, with nude dancers in Egyptian costumes, and Dagmar Mansell, the big star at the Komische Oper, as Cleopatra. And that really is a sensation. It's always sold out. You can't get tickets for months and months. And that really sparked interest in that repertoire, because of course other theaters said, okay, if Barry Kosky can sort of make big money by having 100% attendance, selling out all these shows, maybe we should try doing something like this too. So after Barry Kosky sort of pointed the way, a theater like the Gorky Theater followed that lead. The Gorky Theater is a post-migrant, very political, very young theater here in Berlin, a very small theater too, and they dug up one of those cabaret operettas by Misha Spoliansky. It's called Alles Schwindel, and it's about dating. So everybody dates everyone, and like in dating apps today, they all pretend to be somebody else and get into a lot of trouble as the show goes along. It's extremely contemporary from today's perspective, and it's very funny, it's very witty, and the songs are very much in that jazz cabaret style. And the Gorky Theatre used young stage actors, young film actors who were just nominated for big prizes. And so they reach a new audience. And when you go to the Gorky and to one of those sold out shows, you see young people who would normally never go to opera. They would never go to a Richard Traubner kind of ball gowns operetta, but they can relate to this kind of operetta. And so again, you are reaching to new audiences. And the third big one here in Berlin is the Tippizelt. It's a tent, and where you can sit down and have dinner, and you sit at a table and you see a big show in front of you. And they were doing Frau Luna, which is the original Berlin operetta from 1899. So it's basically before all of these jazz shows, but they're reviving it in a very glitzy, very show kind of style, very 1920s style. And again, you're reaching another audience. It's very touristy. Lots of Berlin tourists, Americans included, who come here and they want to see real Berlin. They go to this because it's a Berlin show. It plays in Berlin and on the moon. And so you have these three different groups. One is a total commercial theater. The other two are state-subsidized theaters. One's a big opera house with big orchestra, big chorus, big dance group. And the other one, the Gorky, is a small political theater. And they all present sort of the same basic idea, but they sort of represent different aspects of that 1920s Weimar Republic repertoire.
Now, you've given us a sense, I think, of what these operettas might have to offer us now in the 21st century. But I'm curious, what have you come to learn from your work with them?
I've come to learn that especially sexual liberation is not something that just happened in the 1970s. So I'm a gay man. And, when I grew up, I was always told Stonewall is the beginning of everything. So 1969 and then onwards, and it all happened sort of in New York and San Francisco. No, actually, the first sexual revolution happened here in Berlin, in my birthplace. And I was wildly fascinated by this. I always liked musical comedies and sort of, the 1930s films also, Fred Astaire and so forth. And I was amazed that the 1920s shows that were produced here in Berlin sound so similar. When you listen to these old recordings, which are mostly on YouTube now, you would think you're listening to a very good dance band, Paul Whiteman and so forth, recording from the United States. And that was the sound that was cultivated here in Berlin, only that the Berlin texts are actually better. The German texts are actually better. They're kinkier, they're wittier, they have more Jewish humor in them. And I thought, wow, why is all of that forgotten? I mean, why did I never hear of that? And why are all these recordings there on, all the old shellac discs? Why doesn't no one take those as a role model when they put on operettas or any kind of other shows? So for me personally, it was a huge discovery to see what a vibrant, what a rich scene this was here in Berlin, and also to see how internationally connected it was. So if you're talking about Berlin entertainment, musical entertainment from the 1920s. These shows went directly from Berlin to Broadway. The White Horse Inn, for example. It went from Berlin to Vienna to Paris to London to New York. There were talks about a Hollywood version at the time. And the big Broadway shows by Romberg, by Frimmel, by Vincent Youmans, they all came to Berlin and to Vienna. So it was a two-way street. It was a very transatlantic, intense business that was going on. And sadly, the Nazis really interrupted this interaction between these different centers of musical entertainment, and I think it's high time to rediscover it. The fact that young audiences in Berlin who go to the Gorky, to the Komische Oper, to the Tippizelt are a very mixed international audience, and that they really enjoy that 1920s Weimar Republic repertoire again, really shows that we are trying to reconnect to that old era again. And for me personally, as someone who's grown up in Berlin in the 1970s and 80s, when Berlin was a very gray place, a divided city with a wall where you had to go through the Russian zone to arrive in Western civilization again. As someone who's lived through all of that, it really gives me enormous pleasure to see a reconnection with a time when Berlin was really glorious, when it was in that pre-fascist era that you see that you read about in the Isherwood novels, that you see in the Liza Minnelli movie, that you see in all of those old photographs. It's not just Kurt Weill and Brecht and the Three Penny Opera and the Comedian Harmonist. It was the whole city was like that, and it was so liberated. I mean, the whole sexual revolution in terms of LGBT and queer revolution, it all happened and started here in Berlin with Magnus Hirschfeld and all the others, the Institute for Sexual Science. Today, you see this in TV shows like Transparent, where I think in the second or in the third season, there's a lot of Hirschfeld and that institute. I mean, that's all here in Berlin, and Hirschfeld went to these shows. I mean, and these gay and lesbian stars that are connected with Hirschfeld were all in those operettas and reviews. And I find it really fascinating to see what a glorious entertainment industry that was. And it's really way beyond of what happened in O Calcutta and all those gay and lesbian musicals that we praise now on Broadway. We all had that here in Berlin in the 1920s up till 1932. And so for me personally, it's a great joy to discover all of that and to see that a new audience is actually enjoying the rediscovery as well, because it's part of my own history. And I think it's always great to see that your own history is not just your history, but you're part of a larger history and you could connect with others.
We'll post a link to the Operetta Research Centre's website, where you can learn more about the project and find a wealth of information about these delightful works of musical theater. Kevin, thank you so much for telling us about the fascinating lost world of Weimar Operetta.
It was my pleasure.
Mr. Potiphar war, wenn sie so voll Liebesblut war, wie nach Josef sie gesehen, kann ich nur zu gut verstehen, denn ich fühl's im Herzensgrunde, jetzt kommt meine schwache Stunde, oh.
Diese Frau ist ganz verblendet, großer Gott, wie das noch endet, wenn ich bloß schon draußen wäre, nee, Frau, ich hab die Ehre.
Bleib, ach, sei nicht so barbarisch, jetzt wird's mir grad potipharisch, oh.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter and Facebook. You can also visit our website at theaterhistorypodcast.net, where you can find links to all of our episodes, and you can email your questions and comments about the show to theaterhistory@theaterhistorypodcast.net. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our intro music this week is Ich bin die Marie von der Halle Revue, and our outro music is Josef Ach Josef, sung by Fritzi Massary and Max Pallenberg. You can find links to recordings of those songs, as well as many others from the Weimar era, in the show notes for this episode. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.
Sonst verliere ich meine Ruhe und vergesse, was ich tue. Oh.